Hi, I'm Valerie. I'm doing a video series on spiritual disciplines based on a book by Richard Foster called Celebration of Discipline. And today I'm going to talk about the spiritual discipline of solitude. And when I think of solitude, I think of being by yourself in a quiet place, and that's solitude. But Foster defines it in a different way. And he describes it as a state of the mind and a heart. And and so he talks about how you can be in a crowd of people and you can be practicing solitude, and you can be, a desert hermit and you cannot have experienced solitude and really practice that discipline. And so, as always, Foster always comes back to the fact that the purpose of the disciplines are to connect with God, and you can do all these outward expressions, but if your heart is in the wrong place, if the attitude of your heart is off, then you're not practicing the discipline at all, and you might as well not do it. So it's so important every time you start to practice a spiritual discipline to make sure your heart is in the right place, and make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, and if you find yourself not doing it for the right reasons, to just confess that to God. And so really the essence of this discipline of solitude is listening, and just having this state of your mind and heart that you're listening for God to speak to you. And Foster suggests that you set aside time, in your daily routine to have solitude. And this is something that Jesus did a lot, going into, solitary places just to be with the Father. And I think it's important to, when you do practice solitude, to not have these expectations on it, and to just be free to be alone with God. And if, leaving space for Him to speak to you, but it's okay if He doesn't, just sitting there and being alone with God, and just having an attitude of humbling yourself and being ready to listen. And so Foster also talks about, along with setting aside time for solitude, he talks about the little solitudes in your day. And so this can be like early in the morning when you wake up and no one else is awake, or when you're in traffic, you're commuting to work, or just you're taking a walk and you see, this beautiful nature around you. Part of solitude is just being in the moment. And because if you're thinking about, this is something that I struggle with too, if you're thinking about what you're going to do next, or you're, dwelling on something that already happened, you're not in a state of mind or heart that you're listening really for what's happening in the moment. And God can speak in so many different ways. And so, so finding those little solitudes throughout your day, and just whether you're with people or not, having this state of mind where you are just ready to, hear what God wants to speak to you, and obey whatever He tells you. And that's such an important part of the disciplines too. I talk a lot about hearing from God, and it's so important to put yourself in a place where you're available to God, and listening for Him. But if you listen to God and you don't do what He asks you to do, then it's kind of I don't know what the point of that is. So I just encourage you, as you're practicing this discipline, if you hear God speak to you something, to obey that, because God knows exactly what you need. He's wants to take care of you, and so having that attitude, and so then he also talks about, Foster mentions, balancing solitude with community, and all things in moderation. It's important to have community, and I do believe God has wired us to need community, and that's such an important part. So solitude and community, I think both of them are important, and so it's important if you're starting to practice this discipline, to not to always be by yourself, but to also experience community. So then Foster also talks about solitude as being as related to trust. And so another thing that he mentions that you can kind of practice as part of this discipline of solitude is, when I read it, I was like, oh, I didn't think of this as being part of solitude, but I like to not be misunderstood. And it's so easy when you do something, you think, oh, maybe that might be misunderstood, to just always be explaining yourself. And so he talks about the discipline of like doing something and not explaining yourself, just practicing the discipline of silence and holding your tongue, and just trusting that God can be your justifier. And really what this gets at is we want to care about what God thinks of us more than what people think. And so especially if that is something that is a struggle for you, is caring about what people think more than what God thinks, that's a really cool discipline to practice as part of your solitude. And I also want to mention something Foster kind of goes into to keep in mind if you're practicing this discipline of solitude. There's something that he calls the dark night of the soul. And when I read that, I was like, what is this, Batman? Like the Dark Knight? Okay. But it's really something that is a good thing, even though it sounds like a bad thing. And he describes it as the dark night of the soul is a good thing, just like surgery is a good thing for somebody who needs it. And it's just this time when God is really just working on you in a deep way. And there might be a season where you just feel like spiritually dry, like you feel like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling, and you're not feeling God's presence, and you're seeking after God, you're not being disobedient, but you aren't hearing from Him or feeling His presence. And it's important, if you do experience that, to know that God is with you even when you don't feel Him. And that's such an important lesson to learn, because we know God's character, we know His promises are true, and we don't always have to have the evidence right in front of us. And that's something that really does grow your faith, when you just trust in God even when you don't see the evidence, even when you don't feel Him. You know that He's there. And so that's something that can happen as you're practicing this discipline of solitude. So keep that in mind. And also, so solitude is basically just listening for God, being in the moment and trusting Him to guard your reputation, not always explaining yourself, trusting that He is going to take care of you, and that He's with you even when you don't feel Him. And so I encourage you to practice this discipline. And just make space in your daily routine for solitude. And along with that, just embrace the little solitudes that happen throughout your day. And yeah, so that's it for solitude. And next week, stay tuned for, I'm going to talk about the discipline of submission. Thanks.